Okay, here we have the Trailblazing Life of Daniel Boone by Cheryl Harness. As long as people had eyes and minds, they've used them to gaze and wonder what they might see if they ventured out beyond the edge of town. But not everybody had the gumption, or in some cases, the misfortune, to leave the familiar and chance the mysterious. Off they'd go, all sorts of hardy folks, into the woods, on rivers, across deserts, and over the seas. Thanks to them, we have stories, and one of the best is that of trailblazer Daniel Boone. He tramped many a mile gathering up knowledge about young America's frontier, storing all that he learned beyond his keen blue eyes. We Americans are, on the whole, a restless bunch, descended from travelers. When ancestors of the folks Daniel knew as Indians came east from Asia to North America, they might well have found paths made by who knows who or what. Over the ages, descendants of these prehistoric pioneers and newcomers from across the Atlantic Ocean crisscrossed the continent, tracing new trails. Old roads morphed and networked into canals, railroad tracks, city streets, and multi-lane highways, where nowadays cars and trucks zip along at 70 miles per hour. We speed through the clouds in jets, thousands of feet above where beasts and people trudge through the wilds, following in the footsteps of Daniel Boone. We still do. Chapter 1. Pennsylvania. A Colony of Friends. One of the first things to know about Daniel Boone is that time-space intersection at which he entered life on Earth, October 22nd, 1734, according to the old-style calendar, November 2nd, by modern reckoning, near modern-day Reading, Pennsylvania. Penn's Woods. The colony was begun around 50 years earlier by William Penn, son of an aristocratic admiral in the British Navy. William wanted there to be a place where he and his fellow Quakers, nickname for members of the Religious Society of Friends, could worship freely. Peaceable William Penn also made it his business to be friendly and to deal fairly with the neighbors, the Lenapes, as the Delaware Indians called themselves. After Penn's death, when his sons were running things, this would not be the case. In 1737, Thomas Penn persuaded Tish Cohen and other Delaware chiefs to sign a walking treaty, granting to the colony as much land as a man could walk across in a day and a half. Then the Pennsylvanians cleared a forest path and got men to run in relays as fast and far as they could, securing for colonists 65 miles of territory. A bit of a cheat, no? But then, if you're reading this book, you probably know that hard dealings between native folks and newcomers would stain hundreds of years of American history. Ever since the Society of Friends began in England in the mid-1600s, government and church authorities had given the spiritually intense, authority-questioning Quakers all sorts of static. William Penn himself had been jailed in the Tower of London for his beliefs, and England wasn't the only place where a citizen was required to go to the nation's official church. Worshipping otherwise was illegal. So word of friend Penn's venture attracted all sorts of stubborn, religious, peace-craving people. From all over Western Europe, folks whose beliefs had gotten them in trouble with the establishment made their hard journeys across the Atlantic. One of these Pennsylvania-bound pioneer transplant was a weaver from Devonshire, England. George Boone, Daniel's Quaker grandfather, was restless and eager to see what America had to offer. Bold though he was, he believed in looking before leaping. To take himself, his good wife Mary, and their big family across the Atlantic Ocean was an expensive, dangerous deal. So he sent his three oldest, George Jr., 22, Sarah, 21, and 16-year-old Squire, Daniel's future dad, off on a scouting expedition in 1713. Mr. and Mrs. Boone must have liked what they heard because they and their 6 younger children left England in August 1717. By October, they were in Philadelphia, but not for long. They moved 13 miles or so north of the city, but didn't stay there either. No, deep in George Boone's bones was a need to move on, an itch for freedom, and a hankering after land. The old weaver finally came to rest near the present-day town of Reading, Pennsylvania. In 1720, his son Squire married Sarah Morgan, a black-haired Welsh from Wales Quaker girl. Together, Squire and Sarah Boone produced Sarah Cassandra, Israel, Samuel, Jonathan, Elizabeth, Mary, George, Edward, a.k.a. Ned, Squire Jr., and in 1746, Hannah, the baby of the family, in the middle there between Elizabeth and Mary, came their bold, stubborn, peaceable, restless, and future famous wilderness-wandering brother, Daniel Boone. Daniel's World. When Daniel Boone entered the world in the fall of 1734, approximately 600 million other Earthlings were already there, compared to the nearly 6.5 or actually 8 billion these days. Daniel was born into the British Empire, headed by King George II, who squabbled with other monarchs such as King Louis XV of France and Charles VI, head of the Holy Roman Empire. They sent armies over to fight over which royal behind should occupy which throne of power over lands near and far. The struggle between French and British rulers led to one war after another, 4 in all, over in North America, much of which was claimed by both nations. Off and on, the fighting lasted from 1689 until 1763, much to the discomfort of soldiers, native tribes, and colonists, including Daniel Boone, but more about that later. In 1734, the African slave business was going strong, making pockets full of money for almost everyone except the poor sufferers chained down in the bellies of ship after ship. Away, away, Africa's enslaved sons and daughters were carried off to the Americas. In the east, the great empires of the Ottomans and the Mughals were beginning to weaken. Warrior ruler Nadir Shah was driving Afghans out of eastern Persia, now known as Iran. As they had since the 1600s, the Manchus still controlled China, and shoguns of the House of Tokugawa still ruled Japan. Because Japan's leaders feared foreign influences, the Japanese had been kept apart from the rest of the world for a century now. As a result of this isolation, purely distinctive works of art were being made by Japan's artists and writers. Future U.S. President 2-year-old George Washington was already in baby Daniel's world. So was 56-year-old Antonio Vivaldi of Venice, Italy. He taught violin at girls' orphanage and wrote lovely pieces for his young musicians to play. Johann Sebastian Bach, 49, was composing his dramatic, complicated music in Leipzig, Germany. Carl von Linné, aka Carolus Linnaeus, a 27-year-old Swedish naturalist, was inventing a scientific way of naming and classifying plants and animals. Ambitious Benjamin Franklin, 28, was hard at work in his Philadelphia print shop on the 3rd edition of his Poor Richard's Almanac. Off to the south, about 600 miles, James Oglethorpe and 114 other British colonists were still getting organized in their new settlement, Savannah, Georgia. Baby Daniel's grandfather and father were weavers, but George Boone also ground grain in his mill, and Squire did blacksmith work. To survive and thrive on the land, colonial families, grown-ups and children alike, had to learn to do all sorts of things. To build the kind of farms that they were used to, European colonists had to chop trees, pry up stones, clear fields, build fences, barns and houses, and raise gardens, crops, and animals. It was tough work. Dangerous, too, as more and more settlers pushed into native people's homelands. Wild America and its inhabitants could be mighty harsh, but it was in the quiet, sometimes cruel, beautiful wilderness that Daniel Boone would be most at ease. Wilderness School. A few stories survive the centuries that lie between Daniel's childhood and us, up here in his unimaginable future. Once a pair of little girls carrying a heavy bucket sneaked up on dark-haired Daniel asleep in the shade of a tree. They dumped their bucket of fish guts over the boy's head. Daniel sprang to his feet, a smelly, hollering whirlwind of flying fists. He scuffed faces and bloodied noses before those blubbering girls ran home to their mom, who, in turn, stormed off to Mrs. Boone. Sarah Boone, hands on hips most likely, told the other mother that if her daughters didn't know how to behave, then it was high time they were taught good manners. Another time, When folks thereabouts were sick with the smallpox, Mrs. Boone took precautions. Now, way off in Europe and farther east in Turkey, there were those who slowed down this dangerous disease by inoculation, scratching a bit of infection pus into a person's skin so the patient might develop an immunity. Not until 1796 would there be a smallpox vaccination. For now, what Mrs. Boone knew was to keep her children indoors. Daniel and his big sister Elizabeth could hardly stand being cooped up, so they made a plan. If they caught the disease, they'd get it over soon enough, then they could go outside. Goofy, dangerous. Out they crept, hurried to a neighbor's cabin, jumped in bed with a smallpox sufferer, who must have been mightily surprised, then scampered back home. Soon, Mrs. Boone was prying the truth out of her sick, naughty children. She nursed and scolded them until they were well enough to be booted out the door. Daniel made friends with Henry Miller, an older boy who was an apprentice in Squire Boone's blacksmith shop. They liked playing pranks. If someone found his wagon wheels dangling from a roof or a tree, Daniel and Henry were the likely suspects. One night, they coaxed a horse out of Squire's locked barn. Their joyride ended when they tried to jump the horse over a mound of sleeping cows. The boys might have broken their necks. Unfortunately, that is what happened to the poor horse. What about Daniel's education? Many a colonial child was taught his or her numbers and alphabet at home. A person needed to be able to read and calculate enough to measure, trade without being cheated, and understand the meanings in legal papers and Bible verses. Daniel doesn't seem to have been very interested in book learning. From his dad and his friend Henry, Daniel learned metalcraft and how to work on wagon hubs, guns, and traps. From his Uncle George, he learned surveying, which is determining land boundaries, an important frontier skill, and map making. As for formal school, old Daniel would say that he never had a single day of it, but who knows if that's really true. In later years, the wife of one of his big brothers helped Daniel with his reading and writing. Truly, he could express himself on paper, but his spelling would always be as wild and free as the man himself. "Let the girls do the spelling," Squire Boone once exclaimed, "and Daniel will do the shooting." Shooting? Only after Daniel was 12 or 13 did he get a gun from his dad. Before that, the boy used a bow and arrow, or the spear he'd whittled from a sapling. Since he was 9, he'd spent his summers tending his family's dairy cattle. While the cows munched on the meadows, neglectful Daniel practiced his aim on unlucky birds and critters. Silently, he followed trails into the forest where he got his education. Little by little, he learned whose foot made which mark and how to leave no prints of his own. Patiently, he watched and listened beside salt licks and watering places. Whoosh or crack went Daniel's weapon, and down went a turkey, a wildcat or rabbit, deer, elk, bear, or bison. Oh yes, those massive creatures rumbled in the east back then. Soon it was young Daniel, his rifle, traps, and the animals he killed, who provided meat for the Boone's dinner table. There were skins, too, and furry pelts for clothes, moccasins, and for trading and bartering for gunpowder, and other necessities. By the time Daniel was 15, folks in his part of the world knew that Squire Boone's son could hit anything or creature he aimed at with his rifle, then skin, clean, and roast it over his campfire. He'd become an expert woodsman who could survive, even thrive, in the vast outdoors. He learned these things, as well as the language of his native neighbors, by spending day after day with them in the ever-astonishing natural world. Adventuring west. With every new settler, eastern Pennsylvania was growing less wild. The Boone's wanderlust was stirring. Squire had heard fine tales about the beautiful lands off to the south, about North Carolina in particular, and the abundance of animals living there. Adding to his restlessness was the fact that he and his church were upset with one another after his oldest children, Sarah and Israel, married non-Quakers. Squire sold his land and all that wouldn't fit in their little caravan of covered wagons. The family said goodbye to their kinfolks and to the land where Daniel's grandparents, old George and Mary Boone, were buried. "Farewell, Godspeed," said their neighbors, who included John Lincoln, great-grandfather of Abraham, 16th president of the nation yet to be invented. Daniel's family, a couple of his Boone cousins, His friend Henry Miller and a straggling herd of cattle set off on the first day of May 1750. Daniel Boone, not quite 16, rode ahead of them all, scouting out the way. Westward they traveled, across the Susquehanna River, on foot, on horseback, or jouncing this way and that in their wagons. They followed Daniel through the Cumberland River Valley. There was sort of a trail. Remember, folks and beasts had been traversing the continent for countless years. Whether for trade, war, or visiting, people had always been on the move, if only on a path just wide enough for them to walk single file. Often these were creature streets between salt licks or watering places. Later, two-leggers used them to carry their bark, dugout, or skin canoes from one stream to another. The warrior's path, a mystery to most white folks, wound and branched through Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky, between the lands of the Shawnee and Cherokee. As folks settled the 13 colonies, there came to be a post road, barely wide enough for a coach in places, along the long Atlantic coastline. And far away to the southwest, ever since the late 1500s, native folks and Spanish colonists would go from Santa Fe, capital of New Mexico nowadays, all the way to Mexico City if they stayed on El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, the royal road of the interior lands. A ferryman helped the Boones over the Potomac River into Virginia. There in the northernmost Shenandoah Valley, Daniel's family stayed put for a while, but not Henry Miller or Daniel. Adventure was on the young men's minds. A long hunt for Daniel Boone. It was the first of many. He and his friend hiked and wandered through the densely wooded hills, southwestward into the ancestral hunting grounds of the Cherokee. Stalking game, checking traps in cold, clear streams, they worked their way down to the Blue Ridge of North Carolina. Imagine these young men in their long hunting shirts of linsky-woolsey, linen and wool woven together, and smoke-blackened, for waterproofing, buckskin, breeches, and leggings. Instead of costly boots, they probably wore moccasins, fur-lined, perhaps, or stuffed with leaves or deer hair for extra warmth. For headgear, some frontier folks liked the look of jaunty striped tail dangling from the back of a coonskin cap, but not Daniel. He generally wore a wide-brimmed felt hat. Any fur could be used to make felt, but a beaver's glossy pelt was the most desirable. Felt, straw, or any critter's furry skin might be made into hats. Beneath his hat's brim, Daniel's dark hair was tied back with a bit of cloth, or a wong, rawhide strip, also good for mending buckskin, into a queue, pigtail. He and Henry would each have had a knife in a sheath on his belt and a tomahawk on a strap over his shoulder, along with a buckskin shot pouch. In it would be a brass bullet mold, a chunk of lead that could be melted and poured into, some cast lead rifle balls, plus a flint and steel fire starter. Each carried gunpowder and a horn, once belonging to a cow, and a long, heavy rifle. Daniel called his old rifle Tick Licker because some folks said he could shoot a tick off a bear's nose from 100 yards away. After a time, they and their loaded-down pack animals traveled north to Philadelphia, where Daniel and Henry traded a year's worth of peltry, skins, for more than $1,000. Imagine these hard-muscled young men. Rather smelly and grimy they must have been after a year of wilderness camping. Now they got spiffed up in clean clothes and sat down to tavern tables covered with food and drinks. They probably listened to or clapped and sang along with the music of flutes and fiddles, and more than likely danced with many a maiden. At Philadelphia's waterfront, they'd have seen everything from rowboats and fishing shallops to ocean-going, tall-masted brigantines, sloops, and schooners. They must have heard talk about wealthy, public-spirited Benjamin Franklin and his shocking experiments with amazing, mysterious electricity. For almost a month along the wide and narrow cobbled streets of Philadelphia, the most important city in British America, 17-year-old Daniel and his friend Henry had the time of their lives.